All right, what's going on, everyone? My last video that came out Wednesday had some audio issues. I think I've resolved it now, but when I edited that one, it sounded a little different, not bad. And then once it published, I went back and listened to it, and it wasn't great. So hopefully, have that figured out now. I actually did an interview last week that was awesome. It was really fun, but something happened with my audio in the middle of it to where when I got ready to upload it, it was worthless. Like you could hardly hear anything being said. So I'm redoing that one. But needless to say, the technical aspect of all of this is far from a strong suit. So if any of you really know what you're doing when it comes to audio, video, editing, YouTube, any of this stuff, I would be grateful for some tips. I am figuring this out as I go, and sometimes it's a little messy. All right, to start, it looks like another wave of Russian missile attacks were carried out all across Ukraine on December 29th. The Ukrainian prime minister said that 54 out of 69 missiles were shot down. I saw other reports from Russia saying that upwards of 100, even 120 missiles were used in this strike. So I'd say it's safe to say that we don't have exact data there quite yet. But either way, it's clear that at least some of these munitions made it through the Ukrainian air defenses because there were pictures like this one here showing up of fires in Odessa, Kyiv, and elsewhere. In terms of overall impact and damage to Ukrainian infrastructure, we'll see. It's not zero, but sometimes it takes a little while to understand how effective strikes like this actually are. I mean, a burned out tank, that's one tank down, right? But an electrical substation that's on fire, that fire could be put out and electricity back up in a matter of minutes, or it could be some sort of catastrophic damage that's not repairable at all. Moving on to what looks like it may have been some Ukrainian soldiers killed behind the lines in Russia. There were some pictures put out that were a little bit graphic that showed 4 men killed alongside some supplies of demolitions equipment and small arms. I haven't seen Ukraine respond to this. It's possible I missed it, but Russia did provide the names of these 4 potential operatives, which I think does give it a little bit more legitimacy. They said these 4 were engaged and killed by the FSB in the Bryansk region of Russia, which is a little bit northwest of Kyiv, you can see on the map here. If true, I'm pretty sure this would be the first instance of Ukrainian fighters being killed on Russian soil since the war began. It's not crazy to think that Ukrainian Special Operations Forces have or are infiltrating into Russia to carry out a variety of missions. I mean, I tend to not really cover the random fires that have been popping up all over Russia really since this war began because there's so little information about them. But it's not too far-fetched that Ukraine might have a role in that. There was also the attack on the Saki airbase in Crimea back in August, where at least some of the theories were that explosives had been planted on some of the parked planes. More recently, around the attacks on air bases at Engals and Kursk, there has been speculation that some sort of ground party is close enough to the target to provide terminal attack guidance for whatever munitions are being used in those strikes. Now, this event of the 4 supposed Ukrainians that were killed behind Russian lines was circulated pretty heavily on Russian Telegram channels. But outside of just putting the information out there, I didn't really see much of a reaction from Russia. They didn't present it as some sort of really notable escalation in the war. On the topic of strikes and attacks inside of Russian territory, Engals Air Base was hit again, and it's pretty much the same reaction from the two sides as before. Ukraine hasn't really said anything at all. Russia said that a drone was shot down, resulting in 3 casualties on the ground. I've said it before, air defense systems and networks are far from perfect. In fact, I think we generally expect more out of them than they're capable of. But in this case, there are 2 things that stood out to me at least. The first is that something made it this far through Russian airspace without being engaged. I mean, yes, drones, if this was a drone, are smaller than aircraft, but they're still roughly the same size as short-range ballistic missiles. Is Russia's air defense network not operating at full strength? Are there major gaps in the coverage? Or are they really just missing these threats? Even if the drone was shot down halfway between Ukraine and the Engels Air Base, there'd be a lot of questions about how anything made it that far into Russian airspace. But 600 kilometers to a strategic airfield? What's going on? The second item that caught my attention is how is that airfield somehow still vulnerable to attack after it was hit earlier this month? That attack in early December showed that Ukraine is willing and able to conduct these deep strikes inside of Russian territory. And yes, it takes time to shift resources and change a defensive posture, but that was 3 weeks ago. Russian air defense can work. I mean, we've seen it used pretty effectively in Ukraine since the start of the war. Whatever is happening in this airspace between Ukraine and Engels, it just seems like sloppy or careless. One of the reasons that Engals gets targeted is that it houses some of Russia's strategic bombers that have been pretty heavily used so far in this war. That might catch a few people off guard because I tend to still see questions about why aren't bombers being used in the conflict. They are, just not how you might think. Outside of a few occurrences early in the conflict, Russian bombers primarily are being used as like airborne missile platforms more than flying over a target and dropping bombs onto it. In most cases, these bombers are releasing KH-101 cruise missiles. These models have a range of 3,000 kilometers, which means that they can strike anywhere in Ukraine without having to leave Russian airspace, which helps with survivability. As a comparison, the Iskander K, a ground-launched cruise missile, can reach targets between 400 and 1,000 kilometers away. And I know there's a wide range there, but a lot has to do with the type of warhead it's carrying, and that information is not always public. All right, I wanted to get into kind of a little scuff between the Wagner Group and the Russian military. As a little backdrop, the Wagner Group is a Russian private military company with very close ties to the Russian government, so close that in this war, they are essentially a part of the Russian military. I mean, we have private military companies here in the United States. They just get used a little bit differently. I'm not sure what they're called today. I'm pretty sure they've gone through a couple name changes over the years, but what used to be called Blackwater, Triple Canopy, and other organizations like that would take on missions like VIP or site security wherever they were hired. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, really anywhere around the world. However, there were not companies or battalions of Blackwater contractors being tasked as maneuver units in like large U.S. military operations. Things like clearing villages or conducting direct action raids, those were left to the actual U.S. military. Not so with Russia and the Wagner Group. Wagner's organized much more like a traditional military fighting force, along with a lot of pretty new hardware. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan recently said that the Wagner Group actually has Russian soldiers in their ranks that report up through Wagner rather than through the Russian military. That's single source, at least in terms of the public information, but it wouldn't be crazy, and that's kind of saying something. For now, Wagner's primarily focused on the fight around Bakhmut, and a few days ago, a video came out where two Wagner artillerymen addressed the Russian chief of the general staff. I'll put a link in the description of the actual video, but they didn't really hold back on how they felt. In short, they said they're fighting in Bakhmut, but they don't have the artillery needed to support their own men, and asked Gerasimov, when's he going to step up and provide them what they need? In my last video, I talked about possible ammo constraints hitting the Russian army, so this could be a little bit tied to that, but that wasn't my biggest takeaway. Just to be clear, those are soldiers for hire working for a private military contractor complaining that the Russian military leadership isn't providing them the support they need. That's messy. This is just one video, so I don't want to pretend that this 20-second clip perfectly encapsulates their entire relationship, but what a complicated position to be in. I mean, the leader of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has openly criticized the Russian military. They're kind of competing with the Russian army when it comes to recruiting new soldiers, but also they have some level of dependency in terms of supplies and logistics on the Russian military as a whole. Now, I've heard the Wagner Group compared with notorious military groups throughout history, especially some German ones from World War II, but I don't think that's the best comparison. I mean, technically, Russia could just hang these guys out to dry. I don't think that's necessarily happening right now, but you got to think that the priority for equipment and supplies goes to the actual Russian army first and Wagner second. So if anything really starts to become limited, it's possible Wagner is left to fend for themselves. All right, sticking with Bakhmut, not really much of a change there over the past couple weeks in terms of territorial control, but I have noticed a change in some Russian commentators starting to say that the goal isn't so much to capture Bakhmut as it is to cause as many Ukrainian casualties as possible. Could be, but that's been one of the challenging aspects of this war. The tactical and operational goals are murky at best and seem to shift depending on who you listen to. If we go back to the start of the war, Putin laid out his goals as Crimea being recognized as Russian, as well as the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, along with ensuring Ukraine's neutral status. Then in September, he modified that a little bit to the liberation of the Donbass, defense of its people, and conditions for the security of Russia. So how does Bakhmut play into that? Well, a few months ago, especially after Kherson traded hands from Russia back to Ukraine, there was a lot of talk about Russian territorial gains and advances around Bakhmut. That's kind of where the focus shifted. The argument was that Bakhmut is a key intersection in Luhansk, provides a jumping off point to attack Slavyansk and Kramatorsk sometime in the future, but the lines haven't moved a whole awful lot as of late, And I'm starting to hear more and more now about how it is a deliberate meat grinder, similar to places in World War One, where the focus is destruction of the Ukrainian military rather than the actual taking of the town. To be fair, plans change, especially in war, and it's entirely possible that Russia first saw Bakhmut in one respect, and now that's shifted. But it doesn't seem like the intensity of the fighting, the Russian focus, or the tactics around Bakhmut have changed, just the explanation as to why it's important. And that goes back to something that I think has been an issue for Russia since the very start of this war, clearly articulating to the lowest level why they're fighting. For Ukraine, that's easy. They're defending their homes and their families, but for an attacking force, they can be quite a bit more difficult. The Vietnam War might be a good example for us here in the United States. If you listen to NVA and Viet Cong veterans of that war, they knew very well what they were fighting for and how it directly impacted their everyday life. On the other hand, explaining why the fight in Vietnam was important to U.S. service members was a bit more complicated. Was it supporting our allies, stopping the spread of communism? Big picture, that works. But if you're talking about risking your life day in and day out, it really helps a fighting force if the reason for doing so is crystal clear. This is one of those impossible to measure items like morale. It matters, just really hard to nail down. I know the Russian culture is different than my own, so it's impossible to put myself in their shoes, but I have to think that the longer this war drags on, little things like understanding why Bakhmut is important will actually play a role into how some of these battles play out. I want to go back to the Bakhmut map here to show you something that's been on my mind. I'm worried this is going to come across as like nitpicky or overly critical, and I really don't mean it that way. More just kind of like a for your general information. Maps like this one from Live UA Map show the Russian held positions in red. Previously held Russian territory recaptured by Ukraine is in blue. We'll see that on some other maps here. And then the area on the left part of the screen without any filters, that's Ukrainian held. Now it's easy, and I do it myself, to look at this map and think in your head, there's the front line, right where those two colors meet. Imagine like a trench running the length of that map, or maybe it's a street with Russians on one side and Ukrainians on the other. It's just a little more messy than that. There very well could be areas, especially in some of the cities, where the Russian Ukrainian positions are just a building or two apart. But for the majority of the line, there's going to be some significant dead space between the two. So if we zoom in on this area here, now using a map from Defense Politics Asia, so we can actually see the terrain. And by the way, I just threw these flags in the map to illustrate a point. They could be way off or spot on, but it's entirely possible that the Ukrainian fighting positions are on the left side of the map, marked with the flags, and the front line of the Russian forces is in that tree line on the right side of the map, marked with Russian flags. So that dividing line down the middle isn't wrong. It's just sort of a guess. I mean, at the end of the day, the exact location of frontline positions is pretty close held information. So again, these guys doing the mapping have an impossible task. And personally, I think it's pretty incredible what they've been able to do so far. The reason I bring this up is just whenever you see minor shifts in the lines anywhere along the front, be cautious about what that means. As an example, with this imagery here, this front line could shift a couple hundred meters in either direction tomorrow without any activity at this portion of the line and still be accurate. This area east of Izium actually shows a little bit better what I mean. See how the control of territory colors don't butt up right against each other, but there's some breathing room in the middle? This is probably a little more realistic as to what the entire line looks like. Again, not intended as a criticism or to nitpick the work those guys are doing, just something to keep in mind when you're looking at these maps. All right, before we wrap up, if anyone has any audio, video, editing, YouTube suggestions, anything like that, please send them my way. I'm open to suggestions and trying to figure this all out as I go. But that'll do it for now. I'll see y'all next time.